Alexander Reed was not a man who was easily shaken. His life was built on logic, control, and predictability. At 38 years old, he commanded a real estate empire in Chicago, collected business awards, and had the respect of investors and magnates alike. But at that moment, standing in the middle of a luxurious ballroom, surrounded by fake smiles and empty conversations, everything he thought he knew was crumbling before his eyes. At first, he thought he was imagining things. The stress, the champagne, maybe the lighting in the room. But when he blinked, trying to shake off the illusion, the vision remained. Noelle Carter. She was there, standing across the room, smiling at another guest, radiant in an elegant blue dress. 3 years. It had been 3 years since he last saw her, since she walked out of his life without looking back. Time had not worn her down. On the contrary, it had sculpted an even more serene beauty, a lightness he didn't remember seeing before. But it wasn't Noelle that made his heart stop. It was the children. 3 little girls, dressed in light blue, playing around her. Triplets. Identical. Every detail hit him like a punch to the gut. The shape of their faces, the exact shade of their hair, the deep blue of their eyes. The same blue eyes he saw in the mirror every morning. The air was suddenly gone from his lungs. His mind screamed for a logical explanation, but none made sense. He knew it was impossible. He knew those children couldn't be his. Because Alexander Reed was infertile. The diagnosis had been clear: irreversible infertility. No chance, no miracle. He remembered the bitter taste in his mouth when the doctor said those words, remembered Noelle's devastated expression when he told her the truth. But above all, he remembered why he had let her go. She wanted a family, and he could never give her that. So how the hell did these children exist? The world around him warped. The murmurs of the conversations faded into a distant hum. The golden lights of the ballroom seemed to shine in a cold, detached glow. His grip on the champagne glass was so tight that he could hear the glass creak under the pressure of his fingers. His heart pounded in his chest, beating so fast he could almost hear it. He needed to move. He needed to get out of there. He needed air. But his body didn't listen. Instead, his feet carried him straight to her. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if he were walking through a minefield. Cold sweat trickled down the back of his neck, adrenaline tightening his muscles. Noelle still hadn't seen him, but something in the air shifted. As if sensing his presence, she slowly lifted her head. Their eyes met. For a moment, time stopped. The smile on her lips vanished. Her face tensed, her eyes widened in shock, as if she had just seen a ghost. And maybe, to her, that's exactly what he was. He was the past she had left behind. But before either of them could say anything, one of the little girls tugged at the hem of Noelle's dress and asked softly, "Mommy, who is that man?" That word cut through Alexander like a blade. Noelle's eyes flickered between her daughter and him, her expression shifting into something between panic and guilt, as if she was afraid of the truth. The confirmation hit him like a freight train. They were hers. They were hers, and someone else's. His stomach twisted. His gaze darted between Noelle and the children, a silent question burning inside him. But deep down, he already knew. He already knew that everything he believed about his past, and about himself, had just been destroyed. Alexander's entire world felt like it had collapsed in on itself. The weight of what he was seeing pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. His grip on the champagne glass tightened to the point where the delicate stem nearly snapped in his fingers. He barely noticed the shifting murmurs of the guests around him, the curious glances being thrown his way. All he could see was her, Noelle, and the 3 little girls standing beside her. His girls. His mind still refused to fully accept it, but the undeniable truth stared back at him in the form of 3 sets of piercing blue eyes. His eyes. His body moved on its own. He crossed the ballroom, his steps quick, unsteady, as if he were walking through a dream that was moments away from turning into a nightmare. He wasn't sure what he would say. He wasn't even sure if he wanted to know the truth. Because if what he suspected was real, if these children were his, then his entire life had been a lie. Noelle had seen him now. Her expression was frozen, but he could see the panic flicker behind her eyes. Her fingers instinctively curled around one of the little girl's hands, holding on tight. Protective, defensive, afraid. And that fear sent a deep, twisted knot forming in the pit of his stomach. The moment he stopped in front of her, the entire world around them seemed to hush. Even the soft piano music that had been playing moments ago now felt distant, like it was coming from behind a wall. His throat was dry, his pulse erratic, but when he finally spoke, his voice was eerily calm. "Who are they, Noelle?" Her lips parted, but she didn't answer. Not right away. Instead, her gaze flickered to the side, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. She was stalling, looking for an escape. That single hesitation hit Alexander like a slap. The pressure inside him built, his jaw clenching so tightly it ached. "Tell me the truth." His voice was sharper now, cutting through the tension like a blade. His fingers twitched at his sides, desperate to hold on to something, anything, to keep himself from spiraling. He needed to hear her say it. Before she could respond, a small voice cut through the silence. "Mommy?" One of the little girls, the one with a tiny dimple on her right cheek, the same dimple Alexander had since childhood, looked up at Noelle with big, curious eyes. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't grasp the storm brewing in the air. She only knew something was wrong. And that killed him. His gaze locked onto her. Every little feature of that girl was like a mirror reflecting his own past. The freckles across her nose, the way her brow furrowed when she was confused, it was all too much. His hands trembled at his sides, his breathing uneven. How had this happened? Why hadn't he known? Noelle finally looked at him again, her shoulders rising and falling in a shaky breath. And then, with a voice so soft he almost didn't hear it, she said the one word that sent his entire world crashing down. "Yes." A deafening silence followed. Alexander felt his heart stop. The ground beneath him wasn't solid anymore. The noise of the ballroom faded into an unintelligible blur, the walls pressing in around him. 3 years. 3 entire years. That was how long she had kept them from him. How long she had let him believe he could never be a father. How long she had let him suffer in ignorance. His fists clenched at his sides, his vision blurring at the edges. His empire, his success, all the power he had spent years accumulating, none of it mattered now. He had built his life on control, on knowing every possible outcome. But this had been taken from him. Stolen. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Reed had no idea what to do. The ballroom felt like it was closing in on him, the air suddenly too thick, the golden chandeliers casting a harsh light that only made everything feel more artificial. The murmurs of the guests swelled, surrounding him like an invisible force, tightening around his throat. Alexander's entire body was rigid, his pulse hammering against his skull, but he refused to look away from Noelle. His world had just shattered, and she was standing there, calm, composed, as if she hadn't just dropped a bomb that had destroyed everything he thought he knew. His fingers twitched at his sides, itching to grip something, to hold on to anything real. But the only thing real right now was the betrayal sinking into his bones. He had fought his whole life for control, for stability. And yet, in just a few seconds, she had ripped it all away from him. 3 years. 3 entire years she had kept them from him. He had lived all this time believing he was incapable of being a father, believing that some cruel twist of fate had robbed him of the one thing he had never admitted to wanting. And now, standing in front of him, were 3 undeniable pieces of himself. He exhaled sharply, his hands curling into fists. His voice came out lower than he intended, thick with something dangerous. "You knew." Noel flinched, but quickly masked it, glancing around at the eyes now fixed on them. The elite of Chicago lived for scandal, and they had just become the evening's entertainment. But Alexander didn't care. He could barely hear the whispers, barely feel the weight of their stares. All he could see was her. She took a hesitant step forward, her hand reaching out slightly, as if she could contain the storm brewing inside him. "Not here, Alexander. Please." The audacity of it nearly made him laugh. "Not here. Not in this polished, elegant ballroom. Not in front of people who would dissect every word, every glance." But had she given him the same courtesy? Had she spared him this kind of humiliation when she made the decision to erase him from their lives? He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, his voice a harsh whisper now. "How long were you going to keep them from me? Forever? Were they supposed to grow up believing some other man was their father? Was that her plan? To rewrite history and pretend that he never existed?" Noel sucked in a breath, her expression shifting. Guilt, anger, something else flickering in her eyes. "It's not that simple, Alexander." The words snapped something inside him. His chest tightened, his throat burned, his control fraying at the edges. "It's the simplest thing in the world, Noel. You tell a man he has children." She looked away, her jaw tightening, and for a second, just a second, he saw fear. Not fear of him, but fear of something much deeper, something she wasn't ready to say. But before he could push her further, a small voice broke through the tension. "Mommy, is he mad at you?" The little girl with the dimple, the one who looked so much like him that it hurt, was tugging on Noel's dress, her blue eyes wide, uncertain. "And Noel instantly softened, kneeling down, tucking a loose strand of hair behind the girl's ear, her voice gentle. "No, sweetheart. Everything's okay." Alexander felt the ground tilt beneath him. His own daughter was afraid of him. And it wasn't her fault. It was his. He was the stranger in this equation. He had missed everything. Their first words, their first steps, their laughter, their tears. He hadn't been there, not because he didn't want to be, but because he had been robbed of the chance. And now, standing here, watching Noel comfort their child from him, the realization was unbearable. The pain was too much. He had to get out. He had to breathe. His voice was low, cold, barely holding back the storm raging inside him. "This isn't over." And then he turned and walked away, because if he stayed any longer, he wasn't sure if he would break or if he would explode. The cold night air hit Alexander like a slap as he stepped outside, but it did nothing to clear the chaos in his mind. His breaths came fast, uneven, his hands shaking as he loosened the collar of his tuxedo. The streets of Chicago stretched ahead, glowing under the city lights, but for the first time in his life, he had no idea where to go. His entire world had just been ripped apart in front of a room full of people, and the worst part was, it wasn't even about them. It was about the 3 years he had lost. The 3 years he had been a father without knowing it. He leaned against the cool stone wall of the venue, closing his eyes, trying to push back the storm inside him. But the images wouldn't stop. Noel's face, the panic in her eyes. The little girl's voice, "Mommy, is he mad at you?" That small, uncertain question had done something to him, had shattered something inside his chest. He wasn't mad at her. He was mad at the entire goddamn universe. Mad at Noel for keeping them from him. Mad at himself for believing her when she walked away all those years ago. Mad at the cruel twist of fate that had convinced him he was incapable of being a father, only to throw this truth at him when it was too late. He forced his eyes open and reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over his contact list. He should call his lawyer. Find out what his rights were. Noelle had lied. She had stolen time from him, taken something that should have been his. But then, his thumb hesitated. Would that make him any better than her? Fighting for them like they were some kind of business deal? Barging into their lives as a stranger and demanding to be their father? What if they didn't even want him? That thought nearly knocked the air from his lungs. The door behind him swung open suddenly, and the sound of heels clicking against the pavement made his body go rigid. He didn't have to turn around to know it was Noelle. He felt her presence before she even spoke. "You left." Her voice was quieter than before, almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure how he would react. Alexander let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair before turning to face her. "And what was I supposed to do, Noelle? Stand there and pretend everything was fine?" She sighed, wrapping her arms around herself, the wind tugging at the loose strands of her hair. She looked tired. Good. He wanted her to feel just a fraction of the hell that was raging inside him. "I wanted to tell you." His jaw clenched so hard it hurt. "When?" "When they were 18. When I accidentally ran into them on the street one day and saw my own face staring back at me." Noelle flinched, but she didn't look away. And that only made it worse, because it meant she knew he was right. Alexander exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Why, Noelle? Why did you keep them from me?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if weighing her words. And that hesitation, that damn hesitation, only fueled the fire burning inside him. Because it meant there was more to this. More than just fear. More than just regret. And for the first time since he saw them, Alexander realized something chilling. Noelle was still hiding something. The silence between them was suffocating. The distant hum of the city, the occasional honk of a car in the streets of Chicago, none of it reached Alexander. All he could hear was the deafening weight of everything left unsaid. Noelle stood just a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her body rigid as if bracing for impact. And maybe she should. Because whatever little patience he had left was burning away like a wick reaching its end. She was still hiding something. And he wasn't leaving until he knew what it was. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his breathing shallow as he took a step closer. His voice was low, steady, but dangerously sharp. "You're still lying to me." Noelle's body tensed. She shook her head quickly, like she was trying to shut the conversation down before it could go any further. "It's not that simple, Alexander." He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair, the frustration boiling under his skin. "Nothing about this is simple, Noelle. But you had 3 years to tell me. 3 years to pick up the phone, to send a letter, to give me a damn choice. And you didn't." Her jaw tightened, her fingers digging into her arms. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, but no less intense. "And you think I had a choice? You think this was easy for me? Raising them alone? Living with this secret every single day? Watching them grow and knowing they would never know their father? Do you think I wanted that?" Alexander's breath caught in his throat. There was something in her voice, something raw and painful, like she had carried the weight of this for so long that it had become part of her. But that didn't make it right. That didn't erase the fact that she had stolen something from him. "Then why did you do it?" His voice came out harsher than intended, but he didn't care. He needed to hear her say it. He needed to understand why. Noelle hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Enough for him to see the war raging inside her. Enough to confirm that there was something else. Something bigger than just regret. Her lips parted, as if she was about to say something, but then she stopped herself. And that hesitation, that single moment of fear, set off every alarm inside him. Alexander took another step forward, his voice dropping lower. What aren't you telling me? Noelle swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. Her blue eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite place. Fear, sadness, something deeper. And when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because, Alexander, you were never supposed to know. The words hit him like a freight train. His body went rigid, his mind scrambling to make sense of what she had just said. Never supposed to know? A cold chill ran down his spine, the weight of her words settling over him like a crushing force. This wasn't just about fear. This wasn't just about regret. Noelle had made a choice. A deliberate one. And whatever the reason was, it was bigger than he had imagined. The night air was sharp against Alexander's skin, but the fire burning inside him was far worse. Chaos spun through his mind like a raging storm, fury boiling beneath his skin as Noelle's voice echoed over and over again. You were never supposed to know. The words didn't just hit him, they destroyed him. Each syllable was a blade, slicing deeper, tearing apart every illusion he had about his past, about what he thought he knew, about the woman standing before him. Noelle wasn't just guilty. She wasn't just regretful. She was afraid. And the fact that she was afraid spoke louder than any explanation she could have given him. He tried to grab onto something, anything, to keep himself steady, but there was nothing. 3 years. 3 years living a lie. 3 years believing he could never be a father, that something inside him was broken. 3 years stolen from him. Stolen because Noelle had decided, for reasons he still didn't understand, that he should never know about his own daughters. He swallowed hard, fighting to keep his composure, but it was impossible. He needed the truth. He needed to know why she had done this to him, why she had chosen to carry this secret instead of just telling him. And more than anything, he needed to know what else she was hiding. He took a step closer, his gaze locked onto hers, searching for any crack in the walls she had built around herself. But Noelle didn't move. She stood frozen, her arms wrapped tightly around herself like she was trying to physically hold herself together. The wind tossed loose strands of her hair across her face, but she didn't even flinch. She just stood there, staring at the ground as if the truth could somehow be buried beneath the cracks in the pavement. That only made Alexander's fury burn hotter. How could she just stand there, silent, after everything? After dropping a bomb that had completely shattered his life, did she really think he was going to just accept it and walk away? You were never supposed to know. He repeated, his voice low and razor-sharp. What the hell does that mean, Noelle? She inhaled sharply but didn't answer. Her silence was the worst answer of all. Alexander felt his chest tighten, his throat go dry, his patience snap like a fraying thread. He was never the kind of man who lost control. But right now, he wanted to break something. Say something. His voice was like a growl, deep, barely restrained. Tell me the truth. All of it. She closed her eyes for a second, like she was trying to force back a wave crashing inside her, and when she opened them again, he saw something new. Not just guilt. Not just regret. Fear. I can't do this, Alexander. His laugh was short, sharp, dripping with disbelief and anger. You can't? You can't? Do you have any idea what you've done to me? 3 years, Noelle. 3 years believing I could never be a father. 3 years thinking something was wrong with me. 3 years wasted while you looked at those little girls and decided, every single day, that I didn't need to know they existed. The pain in his own words hit him like a punch to the gut, but nothing compared to what he saw in Noelle's face in that moment. She was shaking. Not physically, but inside. He could see it. It was like she was holding something so massive, so crushing, that saying it out loud wasn't even an option. But he couldn't stop now. Who are you protecting? Noelle froze. It was just a second. A single second of absolute silence. But it was enough. His stomach twisted violently. His vision blurred at the edges. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about fear or regret. It was about someone else. And suddenly, all the rage, all the pain, all the fury dissolved into something far worse. A cold, unbearable realization crept into his chest. "Noelle?" His voice was quieter now, filled with something new. Something dangerous. "There's someone else involved in this, isn't there?" She didn't say a word. She didn't deny it. She didn't fight him. She just looked down. And in that moment, Alexander knew. He knew that the truth was far worse than anything he could have imagined. The silence between them felt like a living thing, growing heavier with each passing second. The city around them moved on as if nothing had changed. Cars honked in the distance, the hum of conversations and laughter echoed from nearby restaurants, and the cold wind howled between the towering buildings. But for Alexander, the world had narrowed to this moment, to this woman, to the unbearable weight of the truth she refused to say. Noelle stood stiff, her arms crossed so tightly against her body that it looked like she was physically trying to hold herself together. Her breathing was uneven, her shoulders tense, and her fingers dug into the fabric of her dress as if she were bracing for an impact she had seen coming long before he did. And that scared him more than he wanted to admit. She wasn't just keeping a secret. She was afraid of it. Alexander felt his patience thinning, slipping through his fingers like sand. He had spent his life making careful, calculated decisions, never letting emotions dictate his actions. But this? This wasn't something he could control, wasn't something he could manipulate or bargain his way through. This was 3 years of his life stolen from him. 3 years of missed birthdays, of first steps and first words, of laughter and scraped knees. 3 years of memories he would never get back. And she had the audacity to stand there in silence, refusing to give him what little truth he was owed? His voice came out sharper than he intended, cutting through the cold night air like a blade. "Who is it, Noelle?" She inhaled sharply, her body flinching at the question, but she still wouldn't look at him. The hesitation made his chest tighten, his stomach twist. There was someone else involved. He knew it. He could feel it. And the longer she refused to say it, the worse his thoughts became. Was it another man? Had someone taken his place, convinced her to keep him out of their lives? Or was it something worse, something that had forced her to run? He stepped closer, his jaw clenched so tightly that he could feel the tension burning up his neck. "Say something, damn it!" Noelle finally let out a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I tried to protect you, Alexander." He blinked, his entire body going still. Protect him? His heart pounded against his ribs, his mind scrambling to make sense of her words. His laugh came short, humorless, dripping with disbelief. "Protect me? From what, Noelle?" "From my own children." She snapped her head up at that, and for the first time that night he saw something other than fear in her eyes. Anger. Frustration. Desperation. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her breath coming fast and uneven. It was never about them. The words slammed into him with more force than he expected. His pulse roared in his ears, but before he could respond, Noelle exhaled shakily and squeezed her eyes shut, as if forcing herself to breathe, to not break right in front of him. When she opened them again, her expression had changed. The fire was gone, replaced by something darker, resignation. Defeat. Like she had finally accepted that she couldn't keep running from this. "You don't understand, Alexander." Her voice was quieter now, but it carried more weight than anything else she had said that night. "I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I had to." A cold wave ran through him, sinking deep into his bones. Something about the way she said it, the way her voice trembled just slightly on the last word, set off every alarm in his body. His throat tightened, his fingers twitching at his sides. "Had to." he repeated slowly, tasting the words like poison on his tongue. Noelle swallowed hard, looking away again. She didn't answer. And for the first time since this night started, Alexander realized that whatever truth she was hiding, it was about to destroy much more than just his past. Noelle's words echoed in his mind, looping over and over like a broken record. I didn't leave because I wanted to. I left because I had to. Alexander's breath hitched, his pulse hammering against his skull. Had to. The phrase clung to him like ice, freezing his insides, tightening around his chest like a vice. This wasn't just regret. This wasn't just guilt. There was something else buried beneath her words, something far worse. His hands curled into fists, his entire body stiff, the cold night air barely registering against his heated skin. He had walked into this evening expecting shock, betrayal, maybe even a fight. But he hadn't expected this. The tightness in Noelle's shoulders, the way her fingers trembled against the fabric of her dress, the haunted look in her eyes as if she were standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that one wrong step would send her plummeting into an abyss she wouldn't escape. His stomach twisted violently, a storm brewing inside him, furious and relentless. She wasn't just hiding the truth. She was afraid of it. And that realization sent a slow, creeping dread through his veins. His voice was rough when he finally spoke, low and sharp as a blade. That's not good enough, Noelle. She flinched, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out. Alexander stepped closer, his jaw locked tight, his heartbeat a war drum inside his chest. You left. You disappeared. You took my daughters away from me, and now you expect me to just accept that without an explanation. Noelle exhaled shakily, her arms wrapping around herself like she was trying to keep from breaking apart. The silence stretched between them, heavy and unbearable. Every second that passed only fueled his anger, his desperation, his absolute need for answers. He had already lost too much. He wouldn't let her take the truth away from him too. Tell me the truth. No more excuses. No more running. Her breath hitched. For a fraction of a second, he thought she would finally say it. That whatever she had been holding back for the past 3 years would spill out, that the walls she had built around herself would finally crack. But instead, she shook her head. I can't. The words cut through him like ice. His hands clenched, his control slipping. You can't? His voice was sharper now, filled with something raw and unforgiving. Or you won't. Noelle's eyes snapped up to his, and for the first time, her carefully guarded composure shattered. Her breath came out fast, uneven, her fingers trembling where they clutched at the fabric of her dress. She looked like she was barely holding herself together, like the weight of whatever she was carrying was too much, too dangerous. You think this was easy for me? Her voice cracked, her frustration slipping through. You think I wanted this? To raise them alone? To look at them every single day and know they would never know their father? You think I didn't fight with myself every single day about whether I should tell you? Her words slammed into him with brutal force, but he didn't let them shake him. He didn't care how hard it had been for her. Because she had stolen something from him. She had stolen time, stolen memories, stolen a part of his life that he would never get back. Then why didn't you? Noelle inhaled sharply, looking away, blinking rapidly as if trying to force something down, something she wasn't ready to say. But Alexander wasn't letting her escape this. Not now. He took another step forward, his voice lowering, steady but laced with a dangerous edge. Who are you protecting? Noelle froze. It lasted no more than a second. A fleeting, almost imperceptible reaction. But it was enough. Enough for him to see the sheer panic that flashed across her face before she forced it back down. Enough for him to see the way her body stiffened, the way her fingers dug into her own arms, as if she could physically keep herself from answering. A slow, creeping chill spread through his chest. His stomach twisted violently. It wasn't just her. It had never been just about her. Someone else was involved. Someone she was afraid of. And suddenly, all the anger, all the pain, all the fury inside him gave way to something much, much worse. A deep, paralyzing fear. The cold night air pressed against Alexander's skin, but the fire burning inside him was unbearable. His heartbeat was so loud it drowned out the distant city noise, pulsing in his ears like a countdown to something inevitable. Noelle's reaction had confirmed what he already suspected. This wasn't just about her. There was someone else involved. Someone powerful enough, terrifying enough, for her to carry this secret for 3 years. His entire body felt tight, rigid, his muscles coiled with frustration, fear, and something much darker. He had faced ruthless business rivals, cutthroat negotiations, betrayal on levels most people couldn't fathom. But nothing had ever made him feel this kind of helpless rage. His voice came out low and sharp, his patience snapping like a brittle thread. "Who is it, Noelle?" She didn't answer. She didn't even move. Her breathing had slowed, but her eyes told him everything he needed to know. Wide, uncertain, filled with something that wasn't just guilt, it was dread. She was bracing for impact, for the moment the truth finally broke free, and Alexander realized then that she wasn't just protecting their daughters. She was protecting him. The thought sent a violent shudder down his spine. "You think I can't handle it?" His voice was quieter now, but no less dangerous. "You think I don't deserve to know what the hell happened?" Noelle exhaled shakily, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. For a moment, just a moment, it looked like she might give in. Like she might finally tell him the truth. But then, just as quickly, she clenched her jaw and shook her head. "It doesn't matter, Alexander. That did it." That single dismissive sentence sent a sharp, electric fury through his veins. His hands curled into fists, his vision narrowing. "It doesn't matter?" he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "You stole 3 years from me. 3 years of my daughters' lives. And you stand here and tell me it doesn't matter?" Noelle's head snapped up, and this time, anger flared in her expression. "Because knowing the truth won't change what happened." The words hit him like a freight train. He felt his stomach drop, a cold, suffocating weight pressing against his chest. What happened? His mouth went dry, his body suddenly cold despite the fire raging inside him. The way she had said it, the finality in her voice, the way her breath trembled, the way she refused to meet his eyes, sent alarm bells screaming through his mind. Something had happened. Something so devastating that she had decided he could never know. He took a slow step closer, his voice eerily calm, but his insides were anything but. "What are you saying, Noelle?" She swallowed hard, and for the first time, her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She was breaking. He could see it. Whatever this secret was, it was killing her. His chest tightened painfully. "Tell me what happened." Noelle took a shaky breath, her entire body trembling. Her fingers twisted together, her shoulders caving in as if she were trying to make herself smaller. She looked exhausted, worn, like she had carried this weight alone for too long. And maybe she had. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "I was trying to protect you, Alexander. Because if you knew the truth..." She paused, her throat working as she forced herself to look at him. "You would never be the same again." The world seemed to tilt beneath his feet. The cold wind cut through him, but he barely felt it. Nothing could have prepared him for those words. And for the first time since this conversation started, Alexander wasn't sure if he wanted to know the truth anymore. Everything around Alexander faded into the background. The distant hum of the city, the occasional car passing by, the cold wind cutting through his skin, none of it existed anymore. Only Noelle. Only the way she looked at him, her lips slightly parted, her hands gripping her own arms as if trying to hold herself together. And then, her words. "Because if you knew the truth, you would never be the same again." Something deep inside him tightened, a sharp coil of dread twisting in his chest. He had demanded the truth. Now he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear it. But he had come too far, lost too much, to stop now. "Tell me." His voice came out hoarse, steady, but barely concealing the storm inside him. Noelle inhaled shakily, her body tense as if every muscle was bracing for the impact of her own words. He could see the war in her eyes, the fear, the hesitation, the exhaustion of carrying this secret for so long. But when she finally spoke, her voice didn't waver. "Your father, Alexander." The words hit like a sledgehammer. He blinked, his breath stalling, his entire body turning cold. "What?" Noelle's eyes glistened under the city lights, her voice raw. "He threatened me. He told me that if I ever told you about the pregnancy, if I ever let you be a part of their lives, he would destroy me. And you." Alexander's heart pounded, a slow, deafening thud in his ears. His father, the man who had built an empire, the man he had spent his entire life trying to impress, trying to live up to, had done this. Had taken everything from him before he even had a chance to know it existed. He took a step back, his breathing uneven. "No, that doesn't make sense." "He wouldn't." Noelle shook her head, her fingers trembling at her sides. "He would, Alexander. And he did. He gave me no choice. He said if I stayed, if I told you the truth, he would take everything from me. And from you. That he would ruin me, make sure I could never raise them, never have a life." His stomach twisted violently. He had spent years believing he was broken, that something inside him had failed, that fate had simply been cruel. But it hadn't been fate. It had been his own blood. His own father, deciding that he wasn't fit to be a father himself. The weight of it crushed him. He thought back to every cold conversation, every lesson about strength, about power, about how emotions made a man weak. His father had controlled every part of his life, had shaped him into what he wanted him to be. And when he had found out about Noelle's pregnancy, he had done what he always did. He had taken control. A slow, burning rage crawled through Alexander's chest, different from anything he had ever felt before. This wasn't just betrayal. This was theft. His father had stolen something that could never be replaced: time. 3 years of first words, first steps, laughter, scraped knees, bedtime stories, memories he would never get back. His fingers curled into fists, his jaw tightening. His voice was eerily calm when he finally spoke. "He took them from me." Noelle let out a shaky breath, nodding. "Yes." For the first time in his life, Alexander felt powerless. Completely powerless. He had built his entire empire on control, on knowing every possible outcome before it happened. But he hadn't seen this. Hadn't even known there was a game being played. His father had won. The realization made him sick. Noelle watched him carefully, waiting for him to react, maybe even waiting for him to walk away. Maybe she thought this was too much, that it was too late to fix what had been done. And maybe, for a moment, he thought the same. But then, the fury inside him hardened into something else. Determination. He lifted his gaze, steel and fire burning in his eyes. "I'm going to fix this." Noelle's brows furrowed slightly. "Alexander." His jaw clenched, his entire body rigid with purpose. "He stole 3 years from me. I won't let him take anything else." For the first time, Noelle let out a slow breath, something like relief washing over her features. Alexander didn't know what battle he was about to start. But one thing was certain: he wasn't walking away. Not now. Not ever.